Hello, General Biology, and welcome to Section 3.3 of Chapter 3, and this is the first in the screencast series. And as I suggested when I left off from the last screencast, we're going to talk about food chains and food webs, because now that we've talked about the different feeding relationships that take place in the way that the organisms obtain their food, we now have to see how this energy flows through the system. And we're going to see this flow represented by food chains and then much more complex food webs. The energy flows through an ecosystem in a one-way stream. So that means it's a one-direction flow, and that is from primary producers to various different consumers. Okay? So that's how we're going to see this. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is a food chain. And a food chain is going to be just a series of steps in which an organism is going to transfer its energy. And it's going to transfer that energy by eating and being eaten with that. So our ultimate source of energy is going to be from the sun. So here's like my little squiggly rendition of the sun. Not one of the best suns, but it's a sun, okay? Nonetheless. So the sun is going to first transfer its energy to the algae. And the algae is our primary producer. It's going to be able to collect that energy of sunlight, and remember, it's converting carbon dioxide and water into sugars. This is what we're getting from this. So this algae is going to be a producer or an autotroph. And it collects 100% of that sun's energy. And it uses about 90% of that sun's energy for its life processes. So now the algae that you see here is the food source for this fish, this flagfish. So the fish is going to eat the algae. So the sun had provided 100% energy to the algae. As I said, about 90% of that sun energy went towards life processes of that algae, so that when we look at the fish is only going to now be getting about 10% of the energy from the sun. So 10%, it's going to have to consume a lot of the primary producers, a lot of the autotrophs, in order to be able to get the energy that it needs. The fish, this fish, because it feeds directly off of the producers, is called a primary consumer. And more specifically, this primary consumer and all primary consumers are herbivores, because they eat plants. So now this largemouth bass, which I love to fish, is going to eat this flagfish. That's what it's going to consume. Well, 10% of this 10% of energy from sunlight that the fish obtained, 9% of this 10% is going to go to life processes. So that means that this largemouth bass is only going to get 1% of the original energy from sunlight. So it's going to have to consume more in order to get that energy. This largemouth bass is a carnivore and is also known as a secondary consumer. Okay. Now, 0.9% of this 1% is going to go to the life processes to maintain this largemouth bass, so that when the anaga, which is a type of bird, a seabird, eats the largemouth bass, this bird is now only getting just a 0.1% of the energy from the sunlight. So this bird's going to eat the largemouth bass that ate the flagfish, that ate the algae. Again, since this fish is feeding, or this bird is feeding on the largemouth bass, this is known as a tertiary. I can't spell, excuse me. A tertiary consumer, or a third level consumer. It too is a carnivore because it only eats the largemouth bass or fish meat. Okay, so when this alligator now, which is another carnivore, eats the bird, oh, let's go back, I missed this. So about 0.9% of the, or 0.09% of the energy of that 0.10% goes to the life processes of that bird. So that when the alligator eats the bird, it's only getting 0.10% of the energy from the sunlight as we move through this. This alligator is another type of carnivore, but it's known as a quaternary consumer, or a fourth level consumer. So if humans come in and they eat the alligator, then they're even getting less energy directly from the sun than that alligator got. So they're going to have to consume more. But let's say as a human, I came and I caught a flagfish and I ate a flagfish. Well, then I'm going to be getting more energy because I'm eating at a different level. So this simply just shows a very simple food chain that passes energy along, and it kind of gives you an idea of the energy flow. Hopefully that makes sense. We will go over this some more in class. Okay, so in some aquatic food chains, such as the one that we're seeing right here, the primary producers are actually a mixture of floating algae, and that floating algae is called phytoplankton. Again, phyto is going to suggest light, and that they're going to go through this process of photosynthesis, and also some algae. And these producers are eaten by the small fish like the flagfish that we just mentioned. The larger fish like the largemouth bass will eat the small fishes, and then the bass are preyed upon by large wading birds like this onaga and like a heron would be. And then ultimately those birds are eaten by the alligators. So it gives you a flow, a primary flow of energy through there. There are going to be 4 steps in this food chain. So if we break it down like this, these are going to be the steps. The top level consumer, which we call this the apex predator, is 4 steps away from the producer. So this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4. 4 steps away from that producer. So we call these steps trophic levels. Okay, this is primary producers is going to be the first trophic level. The herbivore is going to be the second trophic level. The largemouth bass is going to be the third trophic level. The onaga is going to be the 4th trophic level, and then the alligator is going to be the 5th trophic level. Now I always like to ask this on a test, and I will put a picture and I will ask how many levels away is the deer from from the sun. And if this is the sun and the deer is here, you're going to tell me one trophic level away, 1 step away. So if I had this picture, how many steps away is the onaga from the algae? You would tell me 1, 2, 3 steps away But when I ask you what trophic level does it feed at, it feeds at the 4th trophic level. And that can be a little bit confusing because trophic levels, again, they are feeding levels. But the steps as we go back is whatever we pinpoint as our ultimate beginning for that. All right, we're going to watch this video clip when we get into class. So food chains are very, very simple, and they move in that one direction, and they show the flow of energy in the one direction. But in ecosystems, the feeding relationships are much more complex, and we don't rely just on a single source. There's multiple sources that the organisms will rely on. So ecologists, when they put these relationships together, they call this network of feeding interactions a food web. And we have an example here of a food web. And you can see there's a lot more organisms that are here. They're made up of scavengers and decomposers and detrivores and omnivores and carnivores and herbivores and primary producers. And when we fill this in, and hopefully the arrows are going to come up with this. Nope, they're not. We're going to have to do this all on our own. When we fill this in, this is the way that the flow is going to go. I'm surprised that we don't have this. So the flagfish are going to eat the algae. So we're going to draw the arrow away from the algae. The bass are going to eat the flagfish, and the onaga is going to eat the bass. We also have grass shrimp and worms that are going to eat the algae, and those grass shrimp are going to be eaten by the killifish. The algae will be eaten by the crayfish as well. That crayfish can be eaten by the frog. It can be eaten by the vulture if it's dead. We're going to have the crayfish that is going to feed off of detritus and bacteria and fungi as well. This morin, this type of bird, is going to feed off of the frog. The alligator will feed off of the frog. The vulture will feed off of the remains of the frog, or the alligator. The vulture will eat off of the remains of the bobcat. It'll eat off of the remains of the raccoon, or it'll eat off the remains of the deer. The deer is going to eat the plants and the leaves and the seeds and the fruit. The raccoon is going to eat the crayfish. Do we see how it starts to overlap here? The bobcat is going to eat the raccoon. The bobcat can eat the deer. In that case, the alligator is going to eat the bobcat. The alligator is going to eat the deer. The alligator is going to eat the raccoon. The alligator can eat this bird. All right, so it gets to be really, really complex. And as these die, we're going to have our decomposers and our detrivores breaking down the materials and putting them back up into the plants again. So this represents a food web. Each path through the food web is an individual food chain, and the food web, like the one that is shown here, links all of the food chains in one ecosystem together. So when we take a look at the orange highlighted food chain, that's where the primary producers are that we represented earlier. This is one of the many that make up the web within this Everglade system. So the role of decomposers and detrivores is that when these organisms die, they need to be broken down so that the materials can be used again. So as we said, the biosphere is a closed system. Well, we're running out of time, so hold that thought and we'll catch you in the next screencast.